You don't move to the 4th floor of a walk-up with flickering hallway lights because you're winning at life. You move there because you want to be invisible. Maeve thought the peeling wallpaper and the constant asthmatic rattle of the radiator would be her salvation. A grim little box where her ex could never track her down. She just didn't expect the quiet guy in 4C, the one with the bruised knuckles and impeccable dark suits, to be the reason she couldn't stay hidden. The key stuck. It always sticks when you're desperate. Maeve rattled the cheap brass, the jagged edges of the metal digging into her thumb. Her breath hitched, catching in the back of her throat as a cold sweat pricked her hairline. Just turn. Please turn. The hallway of the St. Jude apartments smelled of boiled cabbage, wet dog, and decades of stagnant dust. The single overhead fluorescent tube buzzed like an angry wasp, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the peeling linoleum. She shoved her shoulder against the warped wood of door 4B. The impact sent a dull throb through her ribs. A parting gift from Simon. 3 weeks old, fading to a mustard yellow, but still tender enough to make her wince when she breathed too deep. "Up and to the left," a voice said. Maeve jumped, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. She spun around, her back hitting her door, her right hand instinctively dropping into her coat pocket where she kept the box cutter. The man standing in the doorway of 4C hadn't made a sound, not a footstep, not the creak of a hinge. He was just suddenly there, leaning against his doorframe. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal wool suit that looked utterly out of place in a building where the rent was paid in uncounted cash and desperate promises. His tie was loosened, his cuffs were rolled back, revealing thick, corded forearms. "The lock," he said. His voice was low, gravelly, but entirely devoid of urgency. "The pins are stripped. You have to pull the handle up, then turn to the left." Maeve stared at him. Her heart was hammering against her sternum, a frantic, trapped bird. She evaluated him the way prey evaluates a new shape in the tall grass. He didn't have Simon's polished, manicured aggression. Simon was loud. Simon took up all the oxygen in a room. This man was entirely still. He wasn't smiling to disarm her. He wasn't leaning forward. He was just observing. She swallowed the dry lump in her throat. "Right, thanks." She turned back to the door, hands shaking so badly she dropped the key. It clattered against the scuffed floorboards, deafening in the quiet hall. Maeve cursed under her breath, dropping to her knees to retrieve it. As she reached out, a scuffed leather dress shoe stepped into her peripheral vision. He had moved across the hall. Maeve froze. The sheer panic spiked, acid burning the back of her throat. She braced for a hand to grab her neck, for the familiar, terrifying yank upward. Instead, the man crouched. He didn't reach for her. He kept his hands visible, resting them on his knees. Up close, he smelled of cold rain, black coffee, and something sharp. Bleach, maybe, or copper. "Let me," he murmured. He didn't wait for permission, but he moved slowly enough that she could have pulled away. He picked up the key. His knuckles were split, the skin red and swollen, scabbed over in angry lines. A dusting of dark hair covered the back of his hand, leading down to long, calloused fingers. He slotted the key into the deadbolt, applied an upward pressure with his left hand on the brass knob, and turned. Click. He pushed the door open, revealing the dark, stagnant air of her new apartment. He stood up and took 2 deliberate steps back, giving her space. "I'm Gabriel," he said. Maeve scrambled up, clutching her duffel bag to her chest like a shield. She didn't offer her name. Giving out her name felt like bleeding in shark water. "Thanks," she repeated, her voice brittle. Gabriel's dark eyes swept over her. They took in the oversized thrift store coat, the exhausted purple bags under her eyes, the way her shoulders hunched inward. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer fake pleasantries. He just gave a barely perceptible nod. "Don't use the chain lock," he advised, turning back toward his own door. "The screws are barely a quarter-inch deep. Anyone with a shoulder and a running start could snap it. Buy a door wedge." Before she could process the morbid practicality of the advice, his door clicked shut. No slam, just a quiet, final latch. Maeve slipped into 4B, kicking the door shut behind her. She threw the deadbolt. Then, disregarding his advice, she slid the chain lock into place anyway. Her legs finally gave out. She slid down the back of the door until she hit the bare floorboards, pulling her knees to her chest. The apartment was freezing. The lone window looked out onto a brick alleyway, the glass grimy with city soot. There was a mattress on the floor in the corner, a rusted sink, and a refrigerator that hummed louder than the hallway lights. It was hideous. It was perfect. She dug the burner phone out of her pocket. The screen was cracked. She powered it on, watching the cheap logo flash. No messages, no missed calls. Simon didn't know this number. Simon didn't know this state. "You're safe," she told herself. "He doesn't know." But as she sat there in the dark, the silence of the building felt heavy. Too heavy. She pressed her ear against the dry wall, separating her apartment from 4C. She expected to hear a television, a phone call, clattering plates. Nothing. Just an absolute, suffocating silence. It was a stillness that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a held breath. Maeve pulled away from the wall, wrapping her arms around her ribs. She was exhausted, a bone-deep weariness that made her joints ache. But she knew she wouldn't sleep tonight. The ghosts were still too loud. 3 days bled into a monotonous blur of bad coffee and hypervigilance. Maeve established a routine born of pure paranoia. She only left the apartment between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. In her mind, this was when the city was busiest, when she could blend into the grey, shuffling crowds of commuters and delivery drivers. She kept her head down, a faded beanie pulled low over a messy knot of dark hair. She learned the rhythms of the building. The couple in 4A fought loudly in Russian on Tuesday nights. The guy in 3B played a trumpet badly every afternoon at 4. And Gabriel in 4C remained a ghost. She saw him exactly twice. Once, he was coming up the stairs as she was going down to check the rusted mailbox. He was wearing a different suit, navy blue this time, but carried the same heavy stillness. He nodded. She looked away. The second time, she heard his door open at 3 a.m. Heavy footsteps moved down the hall. A metallic clink. Then nothing. The thinness of the walls was a cruel joke. While she couldn't hear him, she knew what he could hear. Maeve's nightmares weren't quiet. She woke up gasping, sometimes screaming, thrashing against the cheap sheets as Simon's hands materialized in her dreams. Every morning, she stared at the shared wall, her face burning with humiliation, waiting for Gabriel to bang on the plaster and tell her to shut up. He never did. By Thursday, the stale bread and peanut butter had run out. Maeve had to go to the bodega 3 blocks down. The air outside was biting, a damp, miserable chill that seeped right through her coat. She walked fast, her chin tucked into her collar. The bodega smelled of overripe plantains and cheap detergent. She grabbed a loaf of bread, 2 cans of black beans, and instant coffee. She was at the counter, counting out crinkled dollar bills when she saw it, parked across the street, idling next to a fire hydrant, a black Audi sedan. Simon drove a black Audi. Maeve's lungs seized. The air vanished from the room. She dropped the coins on the counter. They scattered, clinking against the glass display case. "Hey, miss, you short 30 cents. The cashier called out, but his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. She didn't grab her groceries. She bolted. She hit the glass door, stumbling out onto the pavement. Her vision tunneled. He found me. He found me. He found me. The mantra beat against her skull in time with her racing heart. She ducked down a narrow alleyway, her boots splashing through oily puddles. The smell of rotting garbage hit her, but she barely registered it. She pressed her back against the damp brick wall, clawing at her throat. She couldn't breathe. The alley was spinning. She squeezed her eyes shut, but all she saw was Simon's clinical, disappointed smile. "You can't hide from me, Maeve. You're too clumsy." "Hey." The voice cut through the static in her brain. Maeve flinched violently, her eyes snapping open. She raised her arms in a defensive block. Gabriel stood at the mouth of the alley. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket today. Just a black button-down, the sleeves rolled up, revealing the stark lines of a dark, sprawling tattoo on his left forearm. He held a small white paper bag from the bakery down the street. He didn't rush toward her. He stayed exactly where he was. "Look at the brick," Gabriel said. His voice was flat, firm. An anchor dropped in a stormy sea. Maeve shook her head, tears spilling over her lashes, hot and humiliating. "He's here," she gasped, her chest heaving. "The car. He's here." "There is no one in the car," Gabriel said, glancing briefly over his shoulder toward the street. "It's empty. A teenager with a parking ticket on the dash. Look at the brick, Maeve." He knew her name. She hadn't told him her name. The shock of it pierced the panic. She blinked, forcing her eyes to focus on the wall beside her. "Count the mortar lines," he ordered. Not a request, a command. "Top down, 4 of them, count." "1," she stammered, her breath shuddering. 2, 3, 4. "Good. Now, name 3 things you smell." "Garbage," she choked out. "Wet dirt." She inhaled, trying to bypass the panic. And smoke. Gabriel took a slow drag from a cigarette he held in his left hand, exhaling a plume of grey into the damp air. "There you go. You're here. You're not wherever your head just took you." He finally stepped into the alley. He stopped a few feet away, holding out the bakery bag. "You left your groceries at the bodega. The guy at the counter was yelling about 30 cents. Maeve stared at the bag. She wiped her face roughly with the back of her sleeve, hating how pathetic she looked. Hating that this stranger had seen her break. "I don't have money for that," she muttered, staring at his scuffed shoes. "I didn't ask for money." He tossed the bag. It hit her chest lightly, and she fumbled to catch it. It was warm. It smelled of yeast and melted cheese. "Eat. It helps the adrenaline crash." He turned to walk away. "How do you know my name?" she blurted out. The words scraped against her raw throat. Gabriel paused. He didn't look back. The tension in his shoulders shifted, a subtle tightening of muscle under the dark fabric. "Your landlord is a drunk. He leaves the lease agreement sitting on the front desk," Gabriel said smoothly. Too smoothly. "Get a wedge for your door, Maeve. I wasn't joking about the chain." He walked away, his footsteps utterly silent against the cracked pavement. Maeve stood alone in the alley, clutching the warm bag of food. Her panic had receded, replaced by a cold, creeping realization. Gabriel wasn't just observant. He was hyper-aware. He moved like a shadow. He knew how to talk down a panic attack with clinical precision, and his knuckles were always bleeding. She had run from a monster in a tailored suit, only to move next door to a man who looked like he could dismantle one with his bare hands. When she finally went back to the apartment, she stopped at the hardware store on the corner. She bought a heavy-duty rubber door wedge. That night, for the first time in 6 months, she didn't have a nightmare. She slept on the floor, listening to the absolute, terrifying silence from 4C, wondering what kind of violence it took to be that quiet. The St. Jude Apartments laundry room was in the basement. It was a concrete dungeon that felt like a tomb, lit by a single bulb encased in a rusted wire cage. The air down there was thick with humidity, and the smell of mildew. Maeve hated it. She avoided it until she had absolutely no clean clothes left. It was 2:15 a.m. on a Sunday. Simon used to say bad things only happened after midnight. He was usually the one making them happen. Maeve carried her plastic basket down the rickety wooden stairs, the steps groaning under her weight. She wore an oversized grey hoodie, the hood pulled up, the drawstrings pulled tight. She was exhausted. A dull headache throbbed behind her eyes. She turned the corner at the bottom of the stairs and stopped dead. Gabriel was there. He was standing by the large industrial sink in the corner, his back to her. The washing machines were silent. He wasn't doing regular laundry. He had a white dress shirt submerged in the basin, and he was scrubbing it against the ribbed plastic edge with a brutal, rhythmic force. He was wearing a black undershirt, the fabric clinging to the sweat on his back. The tattoo she had glimpsed in the alley snaked up his arm, wrapping over his shoulder, intricate, aggressive line work that looked like thorns and shattered glass. But that wasn't what made Maeve's breath catch. Slung over the edge of a broken dryer nearby was his shoulder holster. The leather was worn, the dark metal of a handgun gleaming dully under the harsh overhead light. Maeve took a step backward. Her sneaker squeaked against the damp concrete. Gabriel froze. The scrubbing stopped. The silence in the basement became sudden and oppressive. He didn't whip around or reach for the gun. He just slowly turned his head, looking over his shoulder. His face was a mask of cold granite. There was a smear of something dark on his cheekbone. Maeve looked from the holster back to the sink. The water swirling down the drain wasn't grey with dirt. It was a pale, watery pink. Every survival instinct she had honed over the last 3 years screamed at her to drop the basket and run. Run up the stairs, pack her duffel bag, and get on the next bus to anywhere. You don't stay in a basement with a man washing blood out of his clothes at 2 a.m. You just don't. But her legs wouldn't move. The fear that paralyzed her was different this time. When Simon was angry, the fear was erratic, a chaotic static that made her feel frantic. This fear was heavy, grounding. Gabriel was dangerous, undeniably so, but he wasn't looking at her like she was a target. He was looking at her like she was an unexpected complication. "You should have made more noise on the stairs," he said quietly. He turned fully around, wiping his wet hands on a towel. He made no move to hide the gun. Maeve swallowed hard, clutching her laundry basket like a shield. "I needed to wash my clothes." It was a stupid, obvious thing to say, but her brain was misfiring. Gabriel's eyes dropped to her basket, then back to her face. He noted the pale, drawn look of her skin, the way she was shivering in the damp cold. He walked over to the broken dryer, casually picked up the holster, and slipped it on over his shoulders. The leather settled against his chest with a soft creak. Then he pulled a dark, zip-up jacket from a nearby chair and put it on, covering the weapon entirely. "Use machine number 3, he said, nodding toward the row of washers. "The others chew up the fabric." He turned back to the sink, drained the pink water, and rinsed the basin out with a heavy blast from the faucet. The smell of raw bleach hit the air, sharp and chemical, burning Maeve's nostrils. She walked forward on stiff legs. She loaded her clothes into machine 3, dumped in a scoop of cheap powder, and pushed the coin slide in. The machine groaned to life, water thundering into the drum. She expected him to leave. Instead, Gabriel leaned against the concrete wall, crossing his arms over his chest. He watched the washing machine spin for a moment before shifting his gaze to her. You flinch when doors close too loud. He said. The observation was blunt. No sugarcoating. Maeve stiffened. She leaned against the vibrating machine, defensive. The doors here are heavy. You check the lock on your door 4 times every night before you go to sleep. Click, clack, click, clack. Then you push it to make sure. Maeve felt the blood drain from her face. You can hear that? I can hear everything. He replied flatly. I can hear you pacing. I can hear you stop breathing when a car backfires outside. He tilted his head, his dark eyes stripping away the layers of her hoodie, seeing right through the armor she tried to project. Who are you hiding from, Maeve? No one. She lied instinctively. It was an ugly, desperate lie. Gabriel laughed. It was a short, humorless sound. Right, you're living in a roach motel, eating canned beans, jumping at your own shadow for the fun of it. Anger sparked in her chest, a sudden flare of heat cutting through the terror. You don't know me. You don't know anything about my life. I know the look of a hunted animal. He countered, stepping away from the wall. He moved closer, stopping just outside her personal space. The scent of bleach was overpowered by the smell of rain and iron clinging to his skin. I've seen it enough times. You look over your shoulder so much you're going to snap your own neck. The guy, he hurt you? Maeve looked away, her jaw tight. She didn't want to talk about Simon. Speaking his name felt like a summoning ritual. He didn't like it when I disagreed. She whispered to the concrete floor. He liked to correct me. Gabriel didn't offer pity. He didn't tell her he was sorry, or that she was safe now. He just stared at the side of her face. The bruise on your ribs, he said softly. From him? Maeve snapped her head up. How do you know about that? The way you favor your left side when you carry groceries, the way you winced when you shoved your door that first day. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. He's looking for you. I covered my tracks, she said, but her voice wavered. Tracks always leave a trail if someone has enough money or enough anger, Gabriel said grimly. If he finds you here, what's your plan? The box cutter in your right pocket? She gasped, instinctively stepping back. How the hell did he notice that? A box cutter requires you to be within arm's reach. Gabriel continued, his tone turning almost academic. If a man who outweighs you is within arm's reach, and he's angry, a 2-inch blade isn't going to save you. It's just going to piss him off. Then what am I supposed to do? Maeve snapped, her voice breaking. The exhaustion finally cracked her facade. Tears blurred her vision. I left everything. I have no money, no family I can call, nothing. I'm living in a shithole with a broken lock, and I can't sleep because every time I close my eyes, I see him. She swiped angrily at her face. So I bought a wedge, and I have a box cutter. It's all I have. She was breathing heavily, the silence of the basement returning in the wake of her outburst, save for the rhythmic sloshing of the washing machine. She expected him to look at her like she was crazy. Instead, Gabriel reached into his jacket. Maeve flinched, bracing herself. He didn't pull the gun. He pulled out a small, heavy black object and held it out to her. It was a can of pepper gel. Police grade. Gel, not spray, he said, his voice dropping into a low, even cadence. Spray blows back in your face if the wind is wrong. Gel sticks to the target, blinds them. Burns like hell. Maeve stared at his outstretched hand. His knuckles were raw, fresh blood dotting the scabs. Take it, he urged softly. Slowly, her trembling fingers reached out. She took the cold metal canister. Her fingers brushed against his rough palm. A jolt of electricity sparked at the contact, a strange, grounding warmth beneath the calluses. If he comes here, Gabriel said, locking his dark eyes onto hers. You blind him. You don't stick around to fight. You run. He paused, a dark shadow crossing his face. A terrifying, absolute certainty settled into his features. You run to 4C, you knock twice, and then you get behind me. He didn't wait for her to thank him. He grabbed his wet shirt from the sink, turned and walked up the stairs, melting into the shadows. Maeve stood alone in the flickering light of the basement, holding the heavy canister in her hand. For the first time in 6 months, she didn't feel entirely defenseless. She was terrified of the man in 4C. She knew he lived in a world painted in blood and violence. But as she touched the cold metal in her palm, she realized a twisted truth. When you're being hunted by a wolf, the best place to hide is right beside the bear. The pepper gel sat on the warped wood of Maeve's nightstand, a dense black cylinder that felt heavier than it looked. She slept with her hand curled around it. November bled into December, and the St. Jude apartments grew colder. The radiator in 4B was a fickle machine. Some nights it hissed and clattered, pumping out a dry, suffocating heat that smelled of scorching dust. Other nights it went completely dead, leaving the room with a bitter chill that seeped up through the floorboards. It was a Tuesday, just past 1 in the morning, when the radiator finally gave up entirely with a pathetic metallic groan. Maeve lay under 2 thin blankets, shivering, staring at the cracked plaster ceiling. The cold was a physical weight, aching in her joints. She needed to move. She threw off the blankets, pulled her heavy thrift store coat over her sweatpants, and walked to the single window. The sash stuck, swollen with rot and winter damp, but she slammed her palms upward against the frame until it yielded with a harsh scrape. The fire escape was a lattice of rusted iron overlooking the alleyway. The air outside was frigid, smelling of exhaust fumes and impending snow. Maeve climbed out, her boots clanging softly against the metal grate. She hugged her knees to her chest, pressing her back against the brick wall, just breathing in the sharp, freezing air. It grounded her. It reminded her that the world was bigger than the tiny, suffocating box she lived in. "You're going to freeze to death out here," the voice came from the right. Maeve jerked, her hand dropping instinctively toward her empty pocket. She'd left the pepper gel inside. Gabriel was sitting on the landing of the fire escape outside the window of 4C. He was entirely swallowed by the shadows, save for the cherry-red ember of a cigarette clamped between his lips. He wore a dark, heavy wool sweater, his legs stretched out over the iron bars. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the darkened street below. "My radiator broke," Maeve said, her voice defensively sharp, masking the tremor of her nerves. "Arthur hasn't bled the boiler since 2018. Gabriel replied smoothly. He took a drag, the ash falling away into the wind. "If you kick the pipe joint near the baseboard, sometimes it clears the vapor lock." Maeve stared at his profile. The dim glow of the alley lights caught the edge of his jaw. There was a purpling, swollen contusion high on his cheekbone, right under his left eye. A fresh cut bisected his eyebrow, the edges red and jagged. It wasn't the kind of injury you get from walking into a door. It was the kind of injury you get from a ring or a brass knuckle. "You're bleeding," she blurted out. It was a stupid observation, lacking any tact, but the words slipped out before her brain could filter them. Gabriel reached up, brushing his thumb casually over his eyebrow. He looked at the smear of dark blood on his skin with mild disinterest, then wiped it on his jeans. "It stops eventually." He didn't explain. He didn't offer a dramatic backstory. He just sat there, a violent man smoking in the cold. Maeve looked away, her teeth beginning to chatter. "Does it ever get exhausting?" she asked quietly. "Does what get exhausting?" "Looking over your shoulder, knowing someone is always waiting to..." correct you." She swallowed hard, the memory of Simon's heavy signet ring flashing in her mind. "Knowing the violence is just waiting for you to drop your guard." Gabriel turned his head slowly. The ember of his cigarette illuminated the hard, flat planes of his face. He didn't offer her a comforting lie. He didn't tell her it gets better. "Yes," he said. His voice was a low, rough rasp against the wind. "It wears the bone down. You stop sleeping. You start evaluating every room by its exits. You look at a person and instantly calculate how long it would take to disable them." He shifted, turning his body slightly toward her. "But you're looking at it wrong, Maeve." "Looking at what wrong?" "The fear." He took a final drag of the cigarette and flicked the butt over the railing. It sparked against the brick before vanishing into the dark. "You let the fear make you small. You're trying to shrink down so he won't see you. But predators don't look for the ones making noise. They look for the ones cowering in the grass." Anger, hot and sudden, flared in her chest. "You think I haven't tried fighting back? You think I just let him?" "I think you survived," Gabriel cut in, his tone devoid of judgment, entirely factual. "You got out. That takes a specific kind of spine. But you brought the cage with you. You're still living inside it." He stood up. The iron fire escape groaned under his weight. He was massive, a hulking silhouette against the smog-choked city sky. He reached through his open window, pulled a heavy, dark green army blanket off his bed, and tossed it to her. It landed heavily in her lap, smelling of stale smoke, cold rain, and him. "Kick the pipe," Gabriel said, stepping back through his window. "And stop acting like prey. It makes you an easy target." The sash slid shut behind him, leaving Maeve alone on the fire escape. She gripped the rough wool of the blanket. It was abrasive against her skin, but it was warm. She hated that he was right. She hated that he saw right through her. But mostly she hated that his brutal honesty felt safer than any kindness Simon had ever offered. It happened 3 nights later, a Thursday. The snow had finally started falling, burying the city under a thick, silencing blanket of white. Maeve was lying on her mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled scrape of a snowplow 3 blocks away. Then came the sound. A heavy, wet thump against her front door. Maeve froze. Her lungs seized, trapping the air in her chest. She stared at the warped wood of her door, illuminated only by the sickly yellow light bleeding under the crack from the hallway. Another sound. A low, ragged scrape, like something heavy sliding down the wood. Then a sharp, suppressed groan. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't someone trying the handle. It was someone collapsing. Her hand scrambled in the dark, her fingers blindly tracing the floorboards until she felt the cold metal of the pepper gel. She grabbed it, her thumb popping the safety latch off. She stood up, her knees popping in the quiet room. She crept towards the door, careful to avoid the loose floorboard that shrieked when stepped on. She pressed her eye to the tarnished glass of the peephole. The lens was scratched and cloudy. The hallway was empty, but at the bottom of the frame, slumping against her door frame, was a mass of dark fabric, a broad shoulder, a patch of dark hair. Gabriel. He was sitting on the floor, his back braced against her door, his chin resting against his chest. His right hand was pressed tightly against his lower left side. Between his fingers, a thick, dark liquid was sluggishly pulsing out, staining his grey shirt a wet, heavy black. Every survival instinct Maeve possessed screamed at her to walk away. "Not your problem. Do not open the door. Bleeding men bring angry men." But she remembered the heavy thud of the army blanket landing in her lap. She remembered the steady, anchor-like weight of his voice in the alley when she was drowning in a panic attack. Damn it. Maeve disengaged the deadbolt. She pulled the wedge free with her foot and cracked the door open. Gabriel slumped backward as the door gave way, catching himself on his left elbow with a sharp hiss of pain. He looked up. His face was the color of dirty chalk, slick with cold sweat. His dark eyes were blown wide, pupils dilated, struggling to focus on her. "Close it," he grated out, his voice a wet rasp. Maeve didn't hesitate. She grabbed the lapel of his jacket and hauled backward. He was dead weight, incredibly heavy. He grunted, his boots scrambling for purchase on the linoleum hallway floor as she dragged him over the threshold. As soon as his legs were clear, she slammed the door, throwing the deadbolt and shoving the rubber wedge violently under the gap. She turned back to him. Gabriel was leaning against her radiator, breathing in shallow, ragged hitches. The smell hit her, then. It wasn't the metallic tang of a scraped knee. It was the heavy, slaughterhouse stench of an arterial bleed mixed with copper and sweat. "Hospital?" Maeve stammered, backing away, her hands hovering uselessly in the air. "You need to go to a hospital. I'll call an ambulance." "No." The word was absolute. He coughed, a wet rattle in his chest. "No cops, no hospitals. It's a through and through. Just missed the kidney." "I don't care what it missed. You're bleeding out on my floor." "Maeve." He locked eyes with her. The flat, cold authority was still there, even as he was rapidly losing blood. "Tape, towels, now." The sheer force of his command short-circuited her panic. She spun around, sprinting to the bathroom. She grabbed the 2 cheap, thin towels she owned and the roll of grey duct tape from under the rusted sink. She practically slid across the floorboards back to him, dropping to her knees. "What do I do?" Her hands were shaking so violently she dropped the tape. Gabriel's head thumped back against the wall. He closed his eyes for a second, gathering his remaining strength. "Pull the shirt up. Press the towel against the exit wound in the back. Hard." Maeve reached out. Her fingers brushed the wet, sticky heat of his blood. Her stomach lurched violently. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat, gritted her teeth, and hauled his ruined shirt upward. The skin beneath was pale and corded with tight, rigid muscle. On his lower back, just above his belt line, was a ragged, weeping hole. She balled up the towel and shoved it against the wound. Gabriel let out a strangled, guttural roar, his spine arching off the wall. His large hand shot out, wrapping blindly around Maeve's wrist like a vice. The grip was agonizing, bruising the bone, but she didn't pull away. "Keep pressing," he ground out, his teeth bared. "Don't let up." I'm sorry," she babbled, tears of pure stress leaking out of the corners of her eyes. She leaned her body weight into her hands, pressing the wadded towel against him. The fabric soaked through in seconds, the warm blood seeping into her own skin, slipping between her fingers. It was horrifyingly intimate. He managed to grab the other towel, wad it up, and press it against the entry wound on his stomach, holding it in place with his forearm. "Tape," he ordered, his chest heaving. Maeve fumbled with the roll of duct tape. Her bloody fingers slipped against the smooth silver backing. She managed to peel an edge, ripping a long strip with her teeth. "Lean forward," she instructed, her voice cracking. He did, grimacing as the movement pulled the torn muscle. Maeve wrapped the tape around his waist, pulling it brutally tight over the towels, anchoring them to his torso. She went around twice, 3 times, creating a crude, tight pressure dressing. When she finally stopped, she fell back onto her heels. Her hands were coated in red. The floorboards around them looked like a butchery. Gabriel slumped back against the wall, his breathing loud and labored in the quiet apartment. He didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at the ceiling, waiting for the tape to do its job. Gradually, the violent shuddering in his muscles began to ease. He slowly rolled his head to look at her. Maeve was sitting on the floor, staring at her blood-stained hands, trembling like a leaf. He didn't thank her. He didn't say it was going to be okay. He reached out his left hand, the one that wasn't covered in blood, and tentatively touched her knee, a brief, anchoring pressure. "Wash your hands, Maeve," he said quietly. "It dries sticky." She looked up at him. The untouchable ghost of 4C was sitting on her floor, broken and bleeding, relying entirely on cheap tape and her shaking hands. He wasn't a monster in a suit. He was just a man. And as she looked at him, the crippling fear that had dominated her life for the past year quietly shifted into something entirely new. It was 2 days before Gabriel could walk without relying on the wall. He spent those 48 hours mostly on Maeve's floor, a silent, heavy presence. She fed him canned soup and changed the dressing on his side with a grim, tight-lipped efficiency she didn't know she possessed. They barely spoke. They didn't need to. The shared secret of the bloody towels tied up in a plastic bag in the dumpster forged a strange, suffocating bond. By Saturday afternoon, he was back in 4C. The silence from his apartment resumed, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a guard dog sleeping on the porch. At 4 p.m., the grey winter light was already dying. Maeve gathered the empty soup cans and the trash, tying the plastic bag off. She unlocked her door, pulling the wedge free. She stepped into the hallway. The fluorescent light buzzed its familiar, angry tune. She walked down the hall, her boots scuffing the linoleum, and pushed open the heavy fire door to the stairwell. And then she stopped. The stench of boiled cabbage and wet dog was gone. The stairwell smelled of something else, something clean, expensive, sandalwood and bergamot. Maeve's heart completely stopped in her chest. The trash bag slipped from her fingers, hitting the concrete landing with a dull thud. A tin can rolled out, clinking loudly down the first 3 steps. Down in the lobby, 2 floors below, a voice drifted up the stairwell well. "I understand she's not on the official lease, Mr. Arthur, but I assure you, my fiancé is severely unwell. I just need a key to check on her. $500 for 5 minutes of your time." The voice was butter smooth, polished, devoid of any regional accent. It was a voice designed to charm bank tellers and terrify subordinates. Simon. Maeve couldn't breathe. The hallway narrowed to a pinpoint. The walls closed in, the peeling paint suddenly suffocating. Her legs turned to lead. The sheer, overwhelming terror she had kept at bay for weeks flooded her system, a toxic shock of pure panic. He found me. Oh God, he found me. "Well now, buddy." Arthur's slurred, gravelly voice echoed upward. "I ain't supposed to give out keys, but 4B, the girl in 4B, she fits the description. Quiet little thing." 4B, Simon repeated. The smile was audible in his voice. "Excellent. Keep the change, Arthur." The heavy, measured thud of expensive leather dress shoes began to ascend the stairs. Step, step, step. The sound broke her paralysis. Maeve scrambled backward, spinning around. Her boot caught on the edge of the fire door, and she went down hard, her knees slamming into the linoleum. Pain flared, white hot, but she didn't care. She scrambled up, frantic, her breath tearing out of her lungs in jagged, ugly sobs. She lunged for her apartment door. She threw herself inside, slamming the wood shut. Her trembling hands fumbled with the deadbolt. Click. She kicked the rubber wedge under the doorframe, stomping on it until it was jammed tight against the floorboards. She backed away, retreating until her back hit the far wall. She reached into her pocket, pulling out the canister of pepper gel. She gripped it with both hands, pointing it towards the door, her entire body shaking so violently her teeth rattled. The footsteps reached the 4th floor. They paused. Maeve stopped breathing. The silence was absolute. Then a soft, deliberate knock, 2 knuckles rapping gently on the wood. "Maeve, darling." The voice penetrated the thin door as if it weren't there. It sounded like he was standing right next to her ear. "It's cold out here. Open the door." She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the heel of her hand against her mouth to stifle a whimper. "Don't make this difficult." Simon's voice lost the butter. The ice bled through. "I paid a lot of money to find this pathetic little rat trap. We are going home. You can walk out of here on your own 2 feet, or I can drag you down the stairs by your hair. Choose." Silence. Then the doorknob rattled. Violently. The locked deadbolt held. "Right." Simon sighed. "Clumsy and stupid." Crack. The door bowed inward. Simon had kicked it. The wood splintered around the deadbolt. The frame groaned in protest, dust showering down from the ceiling. Maeve screamed, a raw, primal sound. Crack! The deadbolt ripped free of the rotting wood frame. The door flew inward, but the rubber wedge caught it. The door jammed halfway open, stopped dead by the friction of the wedge against the floorboards. Through the 6-inch gap, Maeve saw him. The camel overcoat, the slicked-back hair, the handsome, flawlessly symmetrical face twisted into a mask of ugly, naked rage. Simon shoved his arm through the gap, reaching down to blindly pry the wedge loose. "You blind him. You don't stick around to fight." Gabriel's voice echoed in her head. Maeve lunged forward. She didn't close her eyes. She thrust her hands out, aiming the nozzle squarely at the gap, right at Simon's face peering through the crack. She pressed the trigger. A thick, heavy stream of orange gel shot across the room. It hit Simon square in the left eye and across the bridge of his nose. Simon shrieked. It wasn't a manly shout of anger. It was a high, tearing scream of pure, agonizing pain. He ripped his arm back through the door, clutching his face, stumbling backward into the hallway. "You stupid bitch!" he roared, coughing violently as the chemical burn ate into his skin. Maeve didn't wait. She kicked the wedge loose. She ripped the door open. Simon was leaning against the hallway wall, one hand over his burning eye, the other blindly reaching into his overcoat pocket. Maeve bolted past him. She didn't run for the stairs. She ran across the hall. She slammed her fist into the door of 4C12. The door opened instantly. Gabriel stood there. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a grey t-shirt and dark jeans. He looked pale, favoring his left side, but his posture was a wall of concrete. In his right hand, resting casually against his thigh, was the black handgun. Maeve dove past him into the apartment. Gabriel didn't look at her. He stepped out into the hallway, placing his massive frame entirely in the doorway, blocking the entrance. He looked down the hall at Simon, who was scrubbing at his face, squinting his one good, tear-streaming eye at the new obstacle. Simon pulled a silver revolver from his coat. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled, raising the weapon. "Get out of my way!" Gabriel didn't raise his gun. He didn't blink. He just stared at Simon with the cold, dead eyes of a man who had seen 1,000 monsters and knew exactly how to bury them. "You're making a lot of noise in my hallway," Gabriel said quietly. The gravel in his voice scraped against the sudden silence of the building. "I don't like noise." Simon laughed. It was a wet, ragged sound, distorted by the agonizing burn of the pepper gel eating into his sclera. His right eye was swollen shut, a weeping mess of orange chemical and tears, but his left eye, the good one, fixed on Gabriel with rabid disbelief. "You think you're a hero?" Simon spat, his finger whitening on the trigger of the silver revolver. The gun trembled. The man holding it was used to terrifying unarmed women, not facing down a brick wall of a man who looked at the barrel of a .38 with utter boredom. "I will put a hole in your chest and step over you to get my property." Inside the dark threshold of 4C, Maeve crouched on the floorboards, her hands clamped over her ears. Her lungs burned. The air in Gabriel's apartment smelled faintly of old paper, gun oil, and black coffee. It was the scent of a bunker. Gabriel didn't shift his stance. He didn't try to reason with Simon. He didn't offer a witty, cinematic comeback. He operated in the reality of the street, where the man who talks is the man who bleeds. Property. Gabriel echoed softly. Simon leveled the revolver. Move! Gabriel raised his right hand. It wasn't a duel, it was an execution. The sound of the gunfire in the narrow, low-ceilinged hallway was catastrophic. It didn't sound like a pop. It sounded like the sky cracking open in an enclosed space. The concussive wave slammed into the plaster walls, vibrating through the floorboards directly into Maeve's kneecaps. Simon managed to fire a fraction of a second late. His shot went wild, ripping through the cheap drywall 3 feet above Gabriel's left shoulder, showering the linoleum with a fine, chalky white dust. Gabriel's shot did not miss. 2 deafening, rhythmic cracks. Pop, pop, center mass. Simon's body jerked backward as if hit by a speeding truck. The silver revolver clattered uselessly against the baseboard. His knees buckled outward, and he collapsed in a tangled heap of expensive camel wool and shattered pride. He hit the floor hard, his head bouncing once against the linoleum with a sickening thud. Then, absolute silence. The harsh fluorescent light above continued its angry, electric hum. Maeve knelt in the dark, her chest heaving. Her ears rang with a high-pitched, metallic whine that drowned out the world. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the shouting, waiting for the heavy footsteps of Simon charging into the room. Nothing. Just the acrid, sulphurous stench of burned powder drifting into the apartment, burning the back of her throat. Maeve. The voice was muffled through her ringing ears. She opened her eyes and slowly lowered her hands. Gabriel was standing in the doorway, his back to her. His gun was already lowered, pointing at the floor. He leaned against the doorframe, his left arm wrapped tightly around his midsection. His breathing was shallow. He had torn the tape. Maeve crawled forward on her hands and knees. She peered around the edge of the doorframe. Simon lay on his back in the center of the hallway. The front of his pristine overcoat was soaked in a rapidly expanding blossom of dark, heavy crimson. His mouth was open, slack, a thin line of blood bubbling past his lips with a wet, rattling exhale. His one open eye stared blankly at the flickering overhead light. He looked small, the terrifying, omnipotent monster who had controlled her life, drained her bank accounts, and bruised her ribs was just a heap of ruined meat on a dirty hallway floor. He wasn't a god. He wasn't a ghost. He was just a man who had bled out on cheap linoleum. A violent, hysterical shudder ripped through Maeve's spine. She clamped a hand over her mouth, choking back a sob that tasted like bile and adrenaline. Gabriel turned his head. His face was grey, a sheen of cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. The physical toll of the sudden movement was tearing at his fresh wound. "Get up," Gabriel said, his voice flat and devoid of any comforting warmth. "Get off the floor. Do not look at him." Maeve scrambled to her feet, her legs feeling like wet sand. She backed into the center of Gabriel's living room, hugging herself, shaking so violently her teeth clicked together. Gabriel stepped out into the hallway. He kicked the silver revolver far down the corridor, watching it spin away into the shadows. He didn't check Simon's pulse. He didn't need to. He reached into his pocket with his gun hand, pulling out a small black burner phone, and dialed a single number with his thumb. "St. Jude, 4th floor." Gabriel said quietly into the receiver. "Heavy trash. Bring bleach. And I need a needle and thread." "I popped a seam." He hung up. He stepped back into 4C and shut the door, throwing the deadbolt with a heavy, final click. He leaned against the wood, sliding the gun onto a small table by the entrance. He pressed his hand against his side, squeezing his eyes shut as a sharp hiss of pain escaped his teeth. "He's dead," Maeve whispered. The words felt foreign in her mouth. "Yes," Gabriel said. You killed him. Gabriel opened his eyes and looked at her. There was no remorse in his dark irises, no hesitation. I stopped him. There's a difference. He pushed off the door, moving slowly toward the kitchen area. Sit on the couch, Maeve. The adrenaline is going to crash in about 90 seconds, and if you're standing, you're going to crack your skull on the coffee table. Gabriel was right about the crash. It hit Maeve like a physical blow. The frantic, buzzing energy drained from her veins in a rush, leaving her limbs heavy and her stomach roiling. She collapsed onto Gabriel's dark leather sofa, curling her knees to her chest, burying her face in her arms. Gabriel's apartment was aggressively Spartan. There were no pictures on the walls, no decorative rugs, just the leather sofa, a heavy oak desk, a wall of packed bookshelves, and a small kitchenette. It looked like a waiting room for a ghost. Gabriel sat at the kitchen counter under a dim pendant light. He had his shirt pulled up, revealing the blood-soaked duct tape Maeve had applied 2 days ago. He peeled it back with a grimace, exposing the torn, weeping exit wound. He cleaned it methodically with a bottle of iodine and a fresh towel, his face a mask of absolute stoicism. 30 minutes later, there was a sharp, rhythmic knock at the door. 2 fast, 1 slow. Maeve flinched, digging her fingers into the leather upholstery. Gabriel stood up, keeping the bloody towel pressed to his side. Stay here. He opened the door just wide enough to let 2 men slip inside. They wore dark coveralls and carried heavy canvas duffel bags. They didn't look at Maeve. They didn't ask questions. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency. One man handed Gabriel a small, sterile medical kit. The other pulled a heavy, dark tarp from his bag. Hallway is clear, the taller man muttered to Gabriel. Van is out back. We'll take the freight elevator. Arthur is asleep at the desk. You want the carpet cut out? No carpet, just linoleum. Gabriel replied, his voice low. Scrub it with industrial ammonia. Leave the shell casings. I already grabbed them. Patch the drywall hole with the quick dry putty. I don't want Arthur asking questions tomorrow. The man nodded, pulling on a pair of thick nitrile gloves. 15 minutes. You're good, Gabe. They slipped back out into the hallway. Maeve sat paralyzed on the sofa. She listened to the muted sounds bleeding through the door, the heavy, dragging sound of a body being rolled onto a tarp, the harsh, rhythmic scrubbing of stiff bristles against the floorboards, the sharp, toxic smell of ammonia seeping under the door gap, burning her nose. It was a machine, a well-oiled, blood-soaked machine. She looked at Gabriel. He was sitting back at the counter, threading a curved surgical needle under the harsh light. He clamped an alcohol-soaked gauze pad between his teeth, took a deep breath, and began to stitch his own torn flesh. He didn't flinch. He just pushed the steel through the skin, pulled the dark thread tight, and repeated the motion. Maeve felt a wave of profound displacement. She had spent the last 6 months running from a man who used violence as a tool to inflate his ego. Simon hit her to feel big. Simon terrorized her to feel powerful. Gabriel used violence the way a carpenter used a hammer. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't personal. It was just a brutal geometry of problem-solving. You're in the Mafia, she said. The word sounded ridiculous out loud, like something from a cheap movie. Gabriel tied off the suture with a deft twist of his fingers, snipping the excess thread with a pair of surgical scissors. He spit the gauze into the trash can. I'm an independent contractor, he said, taping a fresh bandage over the wound. He pulled a clean black t-shirt over his head. But the people who pay me belong to the families you're thinking of, yes. You kill people for money. I fix problems. Gabriel corrected mildly, walking over to the sink to wash his hands. Sometimes those problems are breathing, sometimes they aren't. He dried his hands and walked into the living room, stopping a few feet from the sofa. He looked down at her. Her face was pale, her dark hair a tangled mess, her oversized coat engulfing her small frame. He had money, Gabriel stated softly. He had resources. If I put him in a hospital, he would have bonded out in an hour. He would have paid a private investigator to sit outside this building. You would never have slept again. Maeve looked away, staring at the floorboards. I know. You're an accessory now, he continued, his tone brutally pragmatic. Technically, you lured him to the door, you blinded him, you gave me the opening. If you go to the police, you will go to prison. They won't care about your bruised ribs. They will care about the dead man with a 6-figure bank account. Are you threatening me? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. I am educating you, Gabriel said. He crouched down, his knees popping in the quiet room. He brought himself down to her eye level. The smell of sandalwood, blood, and cold rain washed over her. The world you lived in before today is gone, Maeve. The rules are gone. The door opened. The two men stepped back in. They carried their duffel bags, which were noticeably heavier. They didn't have the tarp anymore. Oh, floor is clean, the taller man said. Drywall is patched. Smells like a bleach factory, but it's done. We're gone. Thanks, Dom, Gabriel said without looking back. The door clicked shut. The deadbolt slid home. It was over. Simon was erased, reduced to a stain and a secret. Maeve let out a long, shuddering breath. The tears finally came. They weren't tears of grief. They were the bitter, exhausting tears of a dam breaking. She wept for the months of terror, for the cold nights on the fire escape, for the pathetic, hunted animal she had become. Gabriel didn't try to touch her. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just sat on his heels in the dark room, a silent, immovable anchor, waiting for the storm to pass. Morning broke grey and freezing over the city. The radiator in 4C hissed, pumping dry, stifling heat into the room. Maeve sat at the small kitchen counter, wrapping her cold hands around a mug of black coffee. Gabriel stood by the window, looking down at the street below. He wore a crisp, tailored charcoal suit. The bruises on his knuckles were hidden beneath his cuffs. He looked exactly like the man she had met on her first day in the hallway. Quiet, impeccable, dangerous. Your apartment is ruined, Gabriel said, not turning away from the glass. The door frame is splintered. Arthur will notice it when he does his rounds on Tuesday. Maeve stared into the dark liquid in her mug. I don't have anywhere to go. I have a safe house in Queens, 2 bedrooms, secure building. The lease is under a dummy corporation. It's empty. He turned around, leaning against the windowsill, his hands in his pockets. I can put you in a cab right now. I'll give you 5,000 in cash. You change your name again. You start over. Simon is dead. Nobody is looking for you. Maeve looked up at him. The offer was a lifeline, a clean slate. It was exactly what she had prayed for every night while staring at her cracked ceiling. But as she looked at Gabriel, the thought of leaving made her chest tighten with a hollow, suffocating panic. She had spent her whole life trying to live in the light, trying to be good, trying to be normal. And normal had gotten her beaten, tracked, and hunted. Normal was vulnerable. Gabriel wasn't normal. He lived in the absolute pitch-black dark. He was a killer, a fixer, a monster. But when he looked at her, he didn't see prey. He saw someone who had survived. He had given her a blanket when she was freezing. He had given her a weapon when she was defenseless. He had bled on her floor and trusted her to tape him together. You want me to leave? Maeve said, her voice surprisingly steady. I am toxic waste, Maeve. Gabriel said bluntly. The gravel in his voice was thick with warning. I bring violence home with me. I bleed on the rug. The men I deal with make Simon look like a schoolyard bully. If you stay anywhere near me, you will never be safe." "I was never safe anyway," she countered. She stood up. The oversized coat slipped off her shoulders, pooling on the bar stool. She didn't look small anymore. She walked across the room, stopping an arm's length from him. "I ran away from the dark," Maeve said softly, looking up into his hardened, bruised face. "And it found me anyway. It kicked my door in." Gabriel's jaw tightened. A muscle ticked in his cheek. He looked down at her, his dark eyes searching hers for the flinching fear he was so used to seeing in civilians. He didn't find it. "I'm not a good man," he warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous low rumble. "I don't need a good man," Maeve replied. She reached out, her small, pale hand brushing against the lapel of his tailored suit. She felt the heavy, hard shape of the shoulder holster hidden beneath the wool. "I need a bear." Gabriel stared at her. For a long moment, the silence in the apartment stretched tight, a wire about to snap. Then, slowly, the tension bled out of his massive shoulders. He didn't smile. She wasn't sure he knew how, but the absolute, terrifying stillness in his posture softened into something resembling surrender. He reached out, his large, rough hand gently wrapping around her wrist. He didn't squeeze. He just held her there, grounding her, pulling her slightly closer into his orbit. The smell of cold rain and copper enveloped her. "Go pack your bag," Gabriel murmured, his thumb brushing over the pulse point on her wrist. "We're leaving the St. Jude." Maeve walked back across the hall to 4B. The hallway smelled faintly of industrial ammonia and lemon. She stepped over the splintered wood of her broken door frame. She didn't pack much, just her clothes, her toothbrush, and the thick green army blanket. As she zipped up her duffel bag, she looked down at the floorboards near the entrance. The heavy black rubber door wedge was lying there, scuffed and useless. She stared at it for a second. Then she picked it up, shoved it into the side pocket of her bag, and walked out. She didn't need to lock the door behind her. There was nothing left in the room to protect. Maeve stepped into the hallway, walked into 4C, and let Gabriel shut the door on the world. The deadbolt clicked. Heavy, final, and for the first time in a very long time, Maeve wasn't afraid of the dark. Maeve finally stopped running, realizing that surviving the dark sometimes means learning to walk alongside the monsters who rule it. This marks the intense, gripping finale of Maeve and Gabriel's story. But the underworld they navigate is vast and full of untold secrets. Hit that like button if you loved this dark, slow-burn thriller. Share this story with friends who crave gritty, grounded Mafia romances, and make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming cinematic audio stories. Your support helps bring these dark, unforgettable worlds to life.